Good night, and welcome. Tonight's story takes us to an old countryside hotel where one particular room has quietly puzzled guests for generations. No frightening secrets wait behind its door. No monsters wander its halls. Only a peaceful mystery that has never quite been explained. So settle into your favorite chair, pull your blanket a little closer, and allow the gentle rhythm of this story to carry you into a restful night. If you enjoy slow, calming sleep stories like this one, consider subscribing so you won't miss our next peaceful journey. Now, let us begin. On the northern edge of a quiet valley stood an old stone hotel known as the Ashwood Inn. It was neither grand nor famous. Travelers rarely found it by accident. Those who arrived usually came because someone, somewhere, had once whispered, "If you ever pass Ashwood Hill, stay the night." The inn had stood for more than a century. Its ivy-covered walls changed with every season. In spring, soft green leaves climbed the stone. In autumn, golden vines shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Winter wrapped the roof in snow, while summer filled the gardens with lavender and white roses. Inside, everything moved at a slower pace. The grandfather clock welcomed each hour with a gentle chime. The fireplace offered warmth even before guests asked for it. Books rested quietly upon polished wooden shelves, waiting for patient readers. The owner, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, had greeted travelers for nearly 40 years. She remembered names. She remembered birthdays. She even remembered how each returning guest preferred their evening tea. Yet among all the comfortable rooms upstairs, one remained strangely different. Room 12. It was always clean, always prepared. Its bed perfectly made. Fresh flowers rested beside the window every morning. And somehow, despite being requested many times, no traveler had ever booked room 12 twice. Not because anything unpleasant happened. Quite the opposite. Those who stayed there always left with a peaceful smile. But none of them ever returned to ask for that room again. Rain arrived just before sunset. Not the kind that hurried travelers from the road. Instead, it fell with a quiet patience, tapping gently against the windows of passing trains and drifting softly through the golden trees that lined Ashwood Hill. Daniel Harper closed the worn leather notebook resting on his lap as the small country bus rounded its final bend. For nearly 15 years, he had traveled from village to village collecting stories that rarely appeared in guidebooks. He preferred forgotten places, old libraries, small cafes, family-run inns where the furniture seemed older than the buildings themselves. He believed every quiet place carried a story. Sometimes, the story simply waited for someone willing to listen. The bus stopped beside an old stone bridge. "This is Ashwood Hill," the driver said with a warm smile. Daniel thanked him, stepped onto the quiet road, and watched the bus disappear into the evening mist. The village greeted him with remarkable stillness. A bakery was closing for the evening. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the cool autumn air. Across the square, an elderly couple slowly folded the striped awning above their flower shop. A small church bell rang 6 gentle notes before silence returned once more. At the far end of the lane stood Ashwood Inn. Its windows glowed with warm amber light against the deepening blue of evening. Thin ribbons of smoke drifted peacefully from the old chimney. For reasons Daniel could not explain, the building felt less like a hotel, and more like a place that had been quietly expecting him. He smiled to himself. Perhaps every good journey began with that feeling. He adjusted the strap of his travel bag and walked toward the welcoming front door. The old brass bell above it chimed softly as he stepped inside. The warmth of Ashwood Inn welcomed Daniel the moment the door closed behind him. Outside, the rain continued its gentle conversation with the cobblestones. Inside, only the quiet crackle of the fireplace and the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock filled the air. Behind the polished oak reception desk stood Mrs. Eleanor Finch. Her silver hair was neatly tied beneath a soft blue ribbon, and her smile carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making strangers feel at home. "Welcome to Ashwood Inn," she said warmly. "You must be Daniel Harper." Daniel blinked with surprise. "You were expecting me?" Mrs. Finch smiled as though the question amused her. Travelers who write about quiet places usually arrive eventually. She handed him a small brass key attached to a smooth wooden tag. Room 7. Before climbing the stairs, Daniel noticed a large leather guest register resting upon the reception desk. Its thick pages had yellowed with time. Names stretched back decades. Curious, he glanced at a few recent entries while Mrs. Finch prepared a tray of evening tea. One detail quietly caught his attention. Room 12. Its number appeared again, and again, and again. Different names, different cities, different years. Nothing unusual there. Yet something felt incomplete. Every guest had stayed only once. Not a single familiar name appeared beside room 12 a second time. Daniel gently closed the book. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps travelers simply preferred different rooms on later visits. Or perhaps the old register was quietly protecting a story that had learned the value of patience. Mrs. Finch returned carrying a steaming teapot. Without asking what he had noticed, she placed the tray beside him and smiled. "The fire is warm tonight," she said. "Stories often find people when the weather slows them down." Daniel wrapped both hands around the warm teacup. Outside, the rain continued to fall. After finishing his tea, Daniel wandered into the inn's small library. It was a quiet room tucked beneath the western side of the roof, where tall oak shelves reached almost to the ceiling. A rolling ladder rested beside the books, polished smooth by many years of gentle use. The room carried a comforting scent of old paper, cedar wood, and lavender. Rain tapped softly against the window panes. A reading lamp cast a warm circle of light across a worn leather chair. Daniel smiled. It was exactly the sort of place he loved to discover. He selected a thick book titled The Villages of Ashwood Valley and settled into the chair beside the window. The pages told simple stories. A mill that had stood beside the river. A schoolhouse built by local carpenters. An orchard planted by families who believed every tree should outlive the one who planted it. As he turned another page, something slipped gently into his lap. It was an old postcard. Its edges had softened with age. The picture showed Ashwood in nearly 100 years earlier. The ivy was smaller, the garden younger. Even then, the old hotel looked peaceful. Daniel turned the postcard over. Only one sentence had been written in careful blue ink. "If room 12 welcomes you, leave with gratitude, not questions." There was no signature, no date, no address, only those quiet words. Daniel read them once. Then again, he expected them to feel unsettling. Instead, they felt strangely comforting, almost like advice from someone who had already found what they had been searching for. The rain outside became softer still. Daniel carefully placed the postcard back inside the book, exactly where he had found it. Some messages, he thought, were not meant to be collected, only discovered. The library had grown quieter as evening settled over Ashwood Hill. Daniel closed the old history book with gentle care and carried the memory of the faded postcard downstairs. The fireplace still glowed warmly in the sitting room. Its soft light danced across polished wooden floors, while the grandfather clock welcomed another peaceful hour with a quiet chime. Mrs. Eleanor Finch was arranging fresh white lilies in a small glass vase beside the reception desk. She looked up with the same calm smile. "Finding everything you hoped for?" she asked. Daniel smiled. Perhaps a little more. He hesitated before speaking again. "I found an old postcard tucked inside one of the history books." Mrs. Finch paused for only a moment. Then she nodded gently. "I wondered when someone would discover that one again." Daniel rested his hands lightly upon the polished oak counter. The message mentioned room 12. Mrs. Finch glanced toward the staircase before answering. "Yes." Daniel expected a long explanation. Instead, she simply adjusted one of the lilies until it rested perfectly. Then she said quietly, "People often believe room 12 chooses its guests." She smiled to herself. "I've never believed that." Daniel waited. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than empty. Finally, she continued, "I think the room simply knows when someone has carried a heavy journey for long enough." She looked toward the fire, and when they're finally ready to rest. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. A single drop slipped from the edge of the porch roof. Then another. Daniel found himself looking toward the staircase. Room 7 waited for him upstairs. Yet somehow, his thoughts had already begun climbing toward another door. One with a small brass number that read only 12. The staircase creaked softly beneath Daniel's footsteps as he made his way to the second floor. The hallway stretched quietly beneath a row of small brass lamps whose warm light rested gently upon the polished wooden floor. Room 7 waited exactly where Mrs. Finch had said it would. Inside, everything felt wonderfully peaceful. A neatly made bed stood beneath a patchwork quilt stitched in shades of forest green and cream. A small writing desk faced the window overlooking the gardens. Fresh lavender rested in a glass vase beside a well-worn reading lamp. Daniel unpacked only a few things. His notebook, a fountain pen, a favorite novel whose pages had accompanied him across countless journeys. He opened the window just a little. Cool autumn air drifted inside, carrying the scent of rain-soaked leaves and distant pine trees. Somewhere below, the old grandfather clock chimed 9 slow notes. The inn gradually settled into silence. Doors closed gently. Footsteps faded. The fire downstairs whispered its final crackles before becoming quiet. Daniel lay comfortably beneath the quilt. Sleep almost arrived. Almost. After a while, he decided to stretch his legs. He stepped into the hallway. Every lamp still glowed softly. Every door remained closed. Everything was perfectly still. Then he noticed it. At the far end of the corridor, a thin ribbon of warm golden light rested beneath one door. Not bright, not flickering, simply steady. The brass number reflected softly above it. 12. Daniel listened. No voices, no footsteps, no movement. Only the same peaceful silence that filled the rest of the inn. He stood there for a quiet moment. Curiously, he felt no urge to knock. Some doors, he thought, offered their welcome simply by reminding us they existed. With a gentle smile, he turned back toward room 7. Behind him, the warm light beneath room 12 remained calm and unwavering, like a candle content to keep its own quiet company tea. Morning arrived quietly at Ashwood Inn. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the lace curtains of room 7, painting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. Outside, birds welcomed the new day from the apple trees that bordered the garden. The rain had disappeared during the night. Every leaf now shimmered with tiny drops of morning dew. Daniel opened the window. Fresh autumn air filled the room with the scent of damp earth, cedar, and freshly baked bread drifting from the kitchen below. For a few peaceful moments, he simply stood there, watching the village wake one quiet sound at a time. A milk cart rolled slowly along the lane. The church bell welcomed the hour. Someone laughed softly in the distance. Nothing hurried the morning. Downstairs, the dining room glowed with warm sunlight. A linen cloth covered the breakfast table. Fresh bread, homemade blackberry jam, local honey, and steaming tea waited for the handful of early guests. Mrs. Eleanor Finch greeted Daniel with her familiar smile. "I hope you rested well." "I did," Daniel replied, "though I noticed something curious." She raised an eyebrow kindly. The light beneath room 12. Mrs. Finch poured another cup of tea before answering. "The room has always liked to greet the night before it greets its guests." Her voice carried no mystery, only quiet certainty. Daniel waited for more. None came. Instead, she placed a small dish of warm butter beside the breadbasket. "The jam is made from berries growing behind the old orchard," she said gently. "Please have as much as you like." The conversation drifted naturally toward village life. The weather, the harvest, the migrating birds returning each autumn. Yet somewhere behind every ordinary word, room 12 waited patiently, not demanding attention, simply allowing curiosity to arrive in its own time. Daniel spread blackberry jam across a warm slice of bread. He smiled. Some answers, he realized, tasted bet. After breakfast, Daniel thanked Mrs. Finch and stepped into the crisp autumn morning. Ashwood Hill looked even quieter beneath the clear blue sky. Golden leaves drifted lazily from the maple trees, turning the narrow lanes into soft carpets of amber and bronze. He wandered without a map. The village was small enough that every road eventually greeted the next. At the corner of the square stood a tiny bookshop with a hand-painted sign reading, "Ashwood Books." A small brass bell chimed gently as Daniel entered. The shop smelled of old paper, cedar shelves, and freshly brewed tea. Behind the counter sat an elderly bookseller named Mr. Oliver Grant, carefully repairing the spine of a weathered novel. When Daniel mentioned Ashwood Inn, the old man smiled. "A fine place. And room 12?" Daniel asked. Mr. Grant chuckled softly. "I've never stayed there. But my father did." "What did he say about it?" The bookseller thought for a moment. "He said it was the quietest night's sleep he'd ever known." Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped at the village bakery. The baker smiled when she heard the same question. "My grandmother stayed in room 12. What did she remember?" The baker brushed flour from her hands. "She said she woke feeling lighter than when she arrived." Before returning to the inn, Daniel met an old gardener tending roses beside the church. He, too, recognized the room. My wife stayed there many years ago. And the gardener looked toward the autumn sky. She came home smiling. Daniel noticed something curious. No two people described room 12 in exactly the same way. Yet none of their stories disagreed. Each remembered peace. Each remembered kindness. Each remembered leaving with something invisible, but deeply treasured. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the village square, Daniel quietly wondered if perhaps room 12 did not offer the same gift to everyone. Perhaps it simply offered the one. By the time Daniel returned to Ashwood Inn, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the garden paths. The lavender swayed gently in the cool breeze, releasing a calming fragrance into the evening air. Inside, the inn welcomed him with familiar warmth. The fireplace had already been lit. Its gentle glow reflected across polished wooden floors while the grandfather clock quietly measured another peaceful hour. Daniel settled into a comfortable chair near the window and opened his leather notebook. He filled several pages with simple observations. The kindness of the villagers, the old bookshop, the scent of fresh bread drifting through the square, and of course, room 12, not with certainty, only with questions. He paused, tapping the fountain pen thoughtfully against the page. Some mysteries, he realized, became more beautiful the less they demanded an explanation. The soft sound of footsteps approached. Mrs. Eleanor Finch carried a silver tray with a steaming teapot, 2 delicate porcelain cups, and a small plate of buttery shortbread biscuits. Without a word, she poured the tea. The steam curled lazily into the warm evening light. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the fire. Finally, Mrs. Finch looked toward the staircase. Then back at Daniel. "You've been very patient," she said gently. Daniel smiled. "I suppose I've learned that patience suits this place." She nodded. "It does." She reached into the pocket of her apron and placed a small brass key on the table between them. Its wooden tag bore a single number, 12. "If you still wish to understand room 12. She let the sentence rest for a moment. "Tonight it is ready for a guest." Daniel looked at the key, then at Mrs. Finch. There was no urgency in her eyes. No expectation. Only a quiet invitation. Outside, the last golden light of day faded into the first peaceful BL. Daniel picked up the small brass key. It felt surprisingly warm in his hand, as though it had been resting beside a fire for hours. Mrs. Finch simply smiled. "There is no hurry," she said softly. "The room has waited a long time. It can wait another minute." Daniel nodded, finished the last sip of his tea, and thanked her. Then he began the familiar climb up the old wooden staircase. Each step greeted him with a gentle creak. The hallway was exactly as he remembered. Brass lamps glowed softly against wallpaper patterned with tiny climbing vines. The evening air carried the faint scent of lavender and polished cedar. At the end of the corridor waited the door marked 12. Nothing about it seemed remarkable. The wood was well cared for. The brass handle reflected the warm light of the hallway. Daniel placed the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. With a quiet click, the door opened. The room welcomed him with silence. Not an empty silence. A comforting one. A fire burned gently inside a small stone fireplace. Fresh white lilies rested on the windowsill. A quilt of soft blue and cream covered the neatly made bed. Beside it stood an old reading chair, its cushions slightly worn by years of peaceful evenings. Everything felt familiar, not because Daniel had seen it before, but because it somehow resembled every comforting place he had ever loved. His childhood bedroom, his grandfather's study, a quiet library where rain had once filled an entire afternoon. He walked slowly to the fireplace. Above it hung a framed landscape painting. A winding path crossed gentle hills beneath a golden sunset. Daniel admired it for a moment before turning toward the window. When he looked back, something seemed different. The path and the painting now curved a little farther into the distance. Or perhaps, he had simply noticed another detail. He smiled. Some paintings, like memories, revealed themselves one quiet glance at a time. Daniel placed his travel bag beside the reading chair and slowly settled into the quiet rhythm of room 12. The fire crackled softly. Outside the window, evening drifted across Ashwood Hill, painting the gardens in shades of blue and silver. He reached for the novel he carried on every journey. Its cover had faded over the years. Several pages had become loose from being read so often, yet he rarely finished it. Some books, he believed, existed simply to keep familiar company. He read a page, then another. Soon he realized he had been staring into the fire more than the words. The room seemed to invite that kind of quiet. Not distraction, not excitement, only stillness. His eyes wandered to the landscape painting above the fireplace. The winding path looked exactly as it had before, and yet, it reminded him of a summer afternoon when he was 10 years old, walking beside his grandfather through gentle hills after a light rain. He could almost remember the scent of wet grass, the sound of distant birds, the comforting silence between two people who never felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. Daniel smiled. It was curious. The painting had not changed. His memory had simply stepped forward to meet it. As the fire continued its gentle dance, other peaceful moments quietly surfaced. A snowy evening spent reading beside his parents. A train journey through quiet countryside. A wooden dock where he had once watched the sunrise without speaking a single word. The room offered none of these memories. It merely made space for them, like a calm lake reflecting whatever sky rested above it. For the first time in many months, Daniel realized his thoughts were no longer racing ahead to tomorrow. They had finally become content to rest, here, tonight. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing amber coals. Its warmth filled every corner of room 12 with a quiet comfort that seemed to slow the passing of time itself. Daniel closed his novel and placed it carefully upon the bedside table. As he reached to switch on the small reading lamp, he noticed that one of the table's narrow drawers was slightly open. Not enough to attract attention, only enough to invite a gentle glance. Inside rested a small leather journal. Its cover was smooth with age. The corners had softened from years of careful hands lifting it, opening it, and placing it back exactly where it belonged. There was no title, no lock, only a single sheet of cream-colored paper tucked beneath the front cover. It read, "If these pages offer you a quiet thought, you are welcome to read them. If they do not, simply close the book and let it rest." Daniel smiled. It sounded less like an instruction, and more like kindness. He turned the first page. There were no names, no dates, no hometowns, only short reflections, each written in different handwriting. One read, "I arrived searching for certainty. I left grateful for peaceful questions." Another said, "Nothing extraordinary happened here." Somehow, that became the extraordinary part. A third simply read, "This room reminded me how to listen to silence without feeling alone." Daniel continued turning the pages slowly. Each reflection was different, yet every one ended with the same quiet sentence. "I left carrying less than I brought." He rested his hand upon the open journal. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the branches beyond the window. Inside, the room remained peacefully still, as though it had been listening to these words for many years, and had never grown tired of hearing them. Daniel closed the little leather journal with gentle hands. For a long moment, he simply rested his palm upon its worn cover. He thought about writing something of his own. A sentence, perhaps. A small reflection. But the words never arrived. And somehow, that felt perfectly right. Not every meaningful moment asked to be recorded. Some were complete simply by being lived. He returned the journal to the bedside drawer exactly as he had found it. The reading lamp cast a warm circle of light across the wooden floor. The fire had grown quieter now, its glowing embers rising and falling like slow, peaceful breaths. Outside the window, the village had settled into complete stillness. The church bell had long since fallen silent. No footsteps crossed the lane. Even the wind seemed content to rest among the old apple trees. Daniel noticed a small mantel clock resting above the fireplace. It had escaped his attention earlier. Its brass pendulum moved with quiet certainty. Tick, pause, tick, pause. The sound was never loud. It never asked to be noticed. Yet before long, its steady rhythm seemed to gather every wandering thought and gently set it aside. Daniel leaned back in the old reading chair. His shoulders relaxed. The long miles he had traveled, the deadlines waiting at home, the questions he had carried from one journey to the next, they no longer seemed heavy. Not because they had disappeared, but because, for this one peaceful evening, they no longer needed answers. The clock continued its patient rhythm. The fire whispered softly. Beyond the window, thousands of stars watched over Ashwood Hill. Daniel closed his eyes. Sleep did not arrive suddenly. It came quietly, like an old friend who had always known exactly where to find him. Daniel opened his eyes before the morning birds had begun their songs. The room was wrapped in the gentle blue light that comes just before dawn, when the world seems to pause between night and day. For a few quiet moments, he remained beneath the quilt, listening. The fire had settled into soft gray ash. The little mantel clock continued its patient rhythm. Beyond the window, a cool breeze brushed the branches of the old apple trees. Everything felt wonderfully unhurried. He realized something curious. For the first time in many years, he could not remember dreaming. There had been no restless thoughts, no unfinished conversations, no hurried places to reach, only deep, peaceful rest. Daniel rose slowly and walked barefoot across the polished wooden floor. He opened the curtains. The eastern horizon glowed with the faintest ribbon of silver. Mist rested gently over the gardens, and tiny drops of dew shimmered on every flower. The world looked freshly painted. As he turned back toward the room, his eyes rested once more upon the landscape above the fireplace. The winding path still crossed the quiet hills beneath a golden sky. The old oak tree still stood beside the trail. The distant cottage still rested near the horizon. Then Daniel noticed something he had somehow overlooked before. Near the edge of the path, almost hidden beneath the branches, stood a simple wooden bench. It was small, easy to miss, nothing remarkable about it. And yet, seeing it filled him with an unexpected sense of peace. Not because the painting had changed. It hadn't. Yesterday, he had admired the journey. This morning, he noticed the place where someone could simply stop, sit, and rest. Daniel smiled softly. Sometimes the most important part of a path was knowing that it offered a place to pause. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the hallway as Daniel quietly left room 12. He paused before closing the door. For reasons he could not fully explain, he rested his hand upon the brass handle for just a moment. Then, with a gentle smile, he whispered, "Thank you." The hallway greeted him with the soft glow of early morning. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, filling the old inn with a peaceful golden warmth. Downstairs, Mrs. Eleanor Finch was already outside in the garden. She carried a small watering can, moving slowly between rows of lavender, rosemary, and white roses. Each plant received the same patient care. Never hurried, never forgotten. Daniel joined her along the narrow stone path. "The garden is beautiful," he said. Mrs. Finch smiled. "It has had many gardeners." She paused beside an old oak tree whose branches stretched gently across the garden wall. "The first owner of Ashwood planted this tree more than 100 years ago." Daniel looked up into its broad canopy. "It has seen many travelers." "It has," Mrs. Finch replied. He believed every traveler carried something invisible. Worry, grief, questions. Even happy memories can become heavy when carried for too long. She poured a little water around the roots of the tree. So he built this in with one simple hope. Daniel waited quietly, that everyone who stayed here would find one place where they could safely set those burdens down. She looked toward the second floor where room 12 faced the morning sun, even if only for a single night. The breeze stirred the oak leaves overhead. Tiny shadows danced across the garden path. Daniel breathed deeply. The air smelled of roses, fresh earth, and morning light. For the first time, he began to wonder if the room had never been the real mystery. Perhaps it was simply the quiet kindness with which the entire inn had always welcomed weary hearts. After breakfast, Mrs. Eleanor Finch invited Daniel to follow her up a narrow staircase he had not noticed before. It climbed above the second floor, ending beneath the sloping roof of Ashwood Inn. She unlocked a small wooden door. Warm sunlight streamed through a round attic window, filling the room with floating specks of dust that drifted lazily through the quiet air. "This," she said with a smile, "is where the inn keeps its memories." The attic was beautifully organized. Old trunks rested neatly along the walls. Wooden shelves held carefully labeled boxes. There were antique teacups, faded postcards, brass room keys that no longer fit any locks, and guest ledgers from decades long past. Nothing felt forgotten. Everything felt lovingly preserved. Daniel paused before a long oak table covered with black and white photographs. Most showed smiling travelers standing in front of the inn. Families, couples, solo adventurers, writers, teachers, sailors, musicians. Each picture captured an ordinary moment. Yet together, they carried a remarkable feeling. Mrs. Finch noticed him studying them. My grandfather began taking these photographs, she explained. He believed every traveler deserved to be remembered. Daniel looked closer. The clothing changed from decade to decade. The automobiles in the background grew newer. Hairstyles came and went. Children became grandparents in later photographs. But one detail quietly remained the same. The faces, not identical, not posed, simply peaceful. Each smile seemed lighter than the one before arriving. Not the excitement of finding treasure, not the relief of escaping hardship, just the calm expression of someone who had finally remembered how to rest. Daniel slowly walked past each photograph. He searched for signs that someone had stayed in room 12. There were none. No labels. No special markings. Perhaps that was intentional. After all, the room had never asked to be famous. Daniel continued wandering through the attic at an unhurried pace. Every shelf seemed to hold another quiet chapter of the inn's long history. A weathered walking stick leaned beside an old traveling trunk. An antique compass rested inside a glass case. A faded railway ticket lay carefully pressed between two sheets of parchment. None of these objects were valuable because of what they were. They mattered because of the journeys they had quietly witnessed. Near the round attic window stood a narrow wooden table. Upon it rested a single picture frame. Unlike the others, it held no photograph. Its polished walnut border was simple and elegant. The empty space inside reflected only the soft morning light. Daniel paused. Was a picture lost? He asked. Mrs. Eleanor Finch walked over and smiled gently. No. She brushed a speck of dust from the frame with the corner of a linen cloth. It has always been empty. Daniel looked at her curiously. For more than 100 years? She nodded. My grandfather placed it here. But why? Mrs. Finch gazed toward the attic window where sunlight drifted across the old floorboards. He believed every inn should leave one story unfinished. Daniel remained silent. She continued. Most guests arrive believing their journey is about reaching a destination. She smiled softly. But sometimes, the most important chapter begins after they leave. Daniel looked back at the empty frame. For a moment, it no longer seemed unfinished. It felt full of possibility, as though it quietly belonged to every traveler whose next step had not yet been taken. The sunlight slowly shifted across the room. The empty frame glowed warmly beneath its gentle light. It asked for no photograph, no name, no explanation, only a little room for tomorrow. Daniel smiled. Perhaps the most beautiful stories were never the ones that ended perfectly. Perhaps they were the ones that quietly continued long after the final page. Morning lingered gently over Ashwood Inn. Golden sunlight rested across the wooden floor of room 12 as Daniel quietly packed his travel bag. He folded each shirt with unhurried care. He tucked his notebook between two well-read books. He carefully wrapped his fountain pen inside a soft linen cloth. Nothing about the routine had changed, yet everything felt different. Only yesterday, his thoughts had raced toward the next destination, the next village, the next story, the next train. This morning, he found himself simply enjoying the quiet rhythm of preparing to leave. Before closing his bag, he looked around the room one last time. The reading chair, the small fireplace, the landscape painting with its winding path and little wooden bench, the vase of fresh white lilies resting beside the window. None of these things asked him to stay. They simply wished him well. Daniel smiled. Then he gently closed the door behind him. Downstairs, Mrs. Eleanor Finch was waiting beside the reception desk. The morning sun poured through the front windows, filling the old inn with a warm golden glow. I thought you might like to take something with you, she said. She placed a small cloth pouch upon the polished oak counter. Inside rested a smooth river stone. It was perfectly ordinary, cool to the touch, rounded by many years of flowing water. A tiny handwritten note rested beneath it. When life begins to hurry, hold this stone for a moment. And remember that even rivers become gentle when they stop fighting the bends. Daniel turned the stone slowly in his hand. Its surface had no sharp edges, only quiet patience. He slipped both the note and the stone into his coat pocket, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder. Some gifts became more valuable each time they were remembered. The morning train departed Ashwood Hill with a long, gentle whistle. Daniel found a seat beside the window and placed his leather travel bag carefully on the rack above him. As the train began its slow journey through the countryside, the village gradually disappeared behind fields of golden wheat and quiet rows of maple trees. Ashwood Inn became smaller. Then the church steeple faded into the distance. Soon, only the rolling hills remained beneath the wide autumn sky. Daniel rested comfortably against the seat. For once, he did not reach immediately for his notebook. He simply watched the landscape drift by. Stone bridges crossed peaceful streams. Sheep grazed lazily in open meadows. Small cottages sent thin ribbons of smoke curling into the cool morning air. Every scene seemed content exactly where it was. At the next station, an elderly gentleman quietly took the seat across from him. He carried a neatly folded newspaper, a knitted scarf, and a small paper bag that smelled faintly of fresh apples. After a few peaceful miles, the man smiled kindly. "Beautiful morning for traveling." "It certainly is," Daniel replied. For a while, they watched the countryside together without speaking. The silence never felt awkward. Eventually, the train rounded a gentle curve, revealing a broad lake that shimmered beneath the autumn sun. The elderly gentleman looked out the window and quietly said, "It's strange." "What is?" Daniel asked. "We spend so much of life trying to arrive somewhere." He smiled softly. "And then, every so often, a place reminds us that the journey itself has been taking care of us all along." Daniel felt the smooth river stone resting inside his coat pocket. He wrapped his fingers around it for a quiet moment. The train continued forward. The hills rolled gently past. And without realizing it, Daniel carried the piece of Ashwood Inn with him, not in his suitcase, but in the calm rhythm of his own heart. Several days later, Daniel returned to his small apartment overlooking the quiet rooftops of the city. Everything was exactly where he had left it. Books rested neatly upon their shelves. A kettle waited patiently on the stove. The old wooden desk beside the window welcomed him home with its familiar scratches and ink marks collected over many years of writing. He unpacked slowly. The smooth river stone found a place beside his fountain pen. The notebook from Ashwood Hill rested in the center of the desk. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm. Buses passed below. Neighbors greeted one another on the sidewalk. A distant church bell quietly marked the afternoon. Daniel opened to the first blank page. At the top, he carefully wrote, "The hotel room that never got booked twice." He smiled. It seemed like the perfect title. Yet as he began writing, something unexpected happened. Every sentence about room 12 gently wandered toward something else. Instead of describing the room, he found himself writing about Mrs. Eleanor Finch watering the roses before sunrise, about warm bread shared over quiet conversation, about the old oak tree in the garden, about the empty picture frame waiting patiently for tomorrow. The room remained part of every chapter, but it was never the center. Daniel paused, resting his pen upon the paper. Perhaps that was the quiet secret of Ashwood Inn. Room 12 had never asked to be remembered for its walls, or its furniture, or even its mystery. It simply created a peaceful space where people could remember the gentler parts of themselves. Daniel looked toward the smooth river stone resting beside his notebook. He smiled softly. Some stories begin with a place. The best ones quietly become stories about people. Autumn slowly gave way to winter. The trees outside Daniel's apartment stood quietly beneath pale morning skies, their branches tracing delicate patterns against the clouds. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. He wrote new articles, visited neighboring towns, shared conversations with strangers whose stories deserved to be remembered. Yet every now and then, his hand would slip into his coat pocket, searching for the smooth river stone. Each time he held it, his breathing slowed. It was a small habit, a quiet one, but it always seemed to work. One snowy afternoon, a single envelope arrived with the morning mail. There was no return address, only Daniel's name, written in graceful blue ink. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Mrs. Eleanor Finch. He smiled before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. No long message. No explanation. Only a few carefully written lines. "The roses are sleeping beneath the winter snow. The kettle still sings every afternoon. If your path ever becomes heavy, you will always find a warm cup waiting here." At the bottom, instead of a signature, there was only one small drawing. A tiny oak leaf. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the notebook that held the story of Ashwood Inn. He stood beside the window, watching snowflakes drift quietly between the rooftops. The invitation carried no urgency, no expectation. It asked for nothing in return. Some invitations, he realized, were never meant to persuade. They simply reminded us that somewhere in the world, there was still a light glowing in the window, still a chair beside the fire, still someone quietly hoping that, if needed, we would know the way back. Nearly a year passed before Daniel found himself standing once again at the edge of the old stone bridge leading into Ashwood Hill. The village looked wonderfully familiar. The bakery still filled the morning air with the scent of fresh bread. The flower shop overflowed with bright colors. The church bell welcomed the hour with the same calm voice he remembered. It felt as though time had walked gently here instead of running. Daniel smiled as Ashwood Inn came into view. Its ivy-covered walls glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Thin ribbons of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, just as they had on the day he first arrived. When he stepped inside, the little brass bell above the door chimed its cheerful greeting. Mrs. Eleanor Finch looked up from arranging fresh lilies. Her face brightened instantly. "I had a feeling you'd visit before the roses finished blooming." "So did I," Daniel replied with a quiet laugh. After tea and warm conversation, Daniel's eyes wandered to the familiar leather guest register resting on the reception desk. With Mrs. Finch's gentle nod, he opened it. Many new names filled the pages. Travelers from distant cities, families on holiday, artists, teachers, young couples beginning new adventures. Life had continued beautifully. Then his eyes found the entries for room 12. Again, each name appeared only once. No guest had ever returned to request it. This time, Daniel did not feel curious. He simply smiled. Mrs. Finch noticed. "You understand now," she said softly. Daniel closed the register with care. "I think I do." He rested his hand lightly on its worn leather cover. No one asks for room 12 twice, because they don't come back looking for what they found there. Mrs. Finch's eyes shone with quiet warmth. They carry it with them. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the roses in the garden. Inside, the old grandfather clock marked another peaceful hour. Some rooms were meant to be visited. That evening, Daniel carried his travel bag upstairs once again. Mrs. Eleanor Finch had prepared room 7, just as she had during his first visit. The familiar quilt rested neatly across the bed. Fresh lavender stood beside the reading lamp. Outside the window, the gardens shimmered beneath the golden colors of sunset. Daniel smiled. This room felt like greeting an old friend. After dinner, he wandered quietly through the hallway. The polished wooden floor reflected the warm glow of the brass wall lamps. Everything was peaceful. Everything was wonderfully unchanged. At the far end of the corridor, a soft ribbon of golden light rested beneath the door of room 12. Daniel stopped for a moment. A year earlier, he would have wondered who was inside. He might have imagined questions waiting beyond the door. He might have hoped for another glimpse of the room that had quietly changed his life. This time, he felt none of those things. Instead, he smiled. Somewhere beyond that door was another traveler. Someone carrying worries no one else could see. Someone who had arrived tired, perhaps without even realizing how tired they truly were. Daniel quietly hoped that, by morning, they would discover what he once had. Not answers, not miracles, simply the gentle permission to rest. He stood there only for a moment before continuing toward his own room. There was no need to knock, no desire to look inside. Some gifts became smaller when explained. Their true beauty lived in being experienced. As Daniel closed the door to room 7, he noticed something unexpected. For the first time since arriving in Ashwood Hill, he had walked past room 12 without feeling curious, only grateful. The light beneath the door remained steady, not calling him back, but quietly welcoming someone who needed it now. Morning arrived wrapped in gentle golden light. After a quiet breakfast, Daniel thanked Mrs. Eleanor Finch for her kindness, settled his small travel bag over his shoulder, and stepped outside into the cool spring air. The gardens shimmered with dew. White roses swayed softly in the breeze. The old oak tree stretched its branches toward the brightening sky, just as it had on every morning before. Mrs. Finch walked with Daniel to the front gate. Neither of them felt the need to hurry their goodbye. Some farewells became more meaningful when they were allowed to unfold slowly. "You'll keep writing," she said with a warm smile. "I will," Daniel replied. "And you'll keep welcoming travelers, as long as the kettle remembers how to sing." They both laughed quietly. At the village station, The little train waited patiently beside the platform. Daniel climbed aboard and found his seat by the window. As the whistle echoed through the valley, the train began to move. Slowly, gently, he looked back one final time. Mrs. Eleanor Finch stood beneath the old oak tree, one hand raised in a quiet wave. Behind her, Ashwood rested peacefully among blooming roses and climbing ivy. For a moment, sunlight caught the windows of the second floor. One window reflected the morning sky so brightly that it seemed almost to glow. Daniel smiled, though he could no longer tell which room it belonged to. And somehow, that no longer mattered. The village slowly disappeared behind rolling hills. Yet Daniel felt no sadness. Some places were never meant to be carried in your suitcase. They found a gentler home. In your memories. In your habits. In the quieter way you greeted each new day. As the train continued its journey, Daniel rested a hand over the smooth river stone in his pocket. Home, he realized, was not always the place where you lived. Sometimes, it was simply the place that had taught your heart how to be still. Years passed quietly over Ashwood Hill. The old oak tree grew a little taller. The ivy climbed a little farther across the stone walls of Ashwood Inn. Each spring, the roses returned. Each autumn, golden leaves drifted across the garden paths. And every afternoon, the kettle still sang softly in the kitchen. One peaceful evening, just as the sun began to settle behind the hills, a small country bus stopped beside the old stone bridge. A traveler stepped down. They carried a worn suitcase. Their shoulders seemed tired. Their eyes held the familiar look of someone who had been walking through life a little too quickly. The traveler followed the quiet lane toward Ashwood Inn. The little brass bell above the front door chimed gently. Mrs. Eleanor Finch looked up from arranging fresh white lilies. Her warm smile had not changed. "Welcome," she said. "You must be tired." The traveler nodded. "A little. Then you've come to a good place." She placed a steaming cup of tea upon the reception desk. No questions. No hurry. Only kindness. Outside, evening settled softly over the village. Inside, the old grandfather clock counted another peaceful hour. Far above, at the end of the quiet hallway, one gentle ribbon of golden light rested beneath a familiar door. Room 12. The room was waiting. Not for a particular person. Not for a particular story. Simply for whoever arrived carrying more than they should have to carry alone. And somewhere, many miles away, Daniel Harper paused while writing at his desk. Without quite knowing why, he smiled. Perhaps kindness has a quiet way of traveling. From one place, to one heart, to another, long after the journey itself has ended. The end.